Hello. Today I want to talk about the Polish crisis and French policy in the 1930s. This will finish my summary of the first chapter of R.I.C. Parker's The Second World War. Poland had been a major power during the early modern period in Eastern Europe, but had been dismembered by its powerful neighbors in the 18th century. It was recreated essentially by the League of Nations at the end of World War I, taking territory from Austria, Russia, and Germany. One part of this new Polish state was the anomaly of having a corridor to allow access to the sea, which separated East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. And so this Polish corridor became a very controversial element in German foreign policy. Along with that, the predominantly German city of Danzig was again separated off from the rest of Germany and declared essentially as an international city. So Germany and Poland. Over the winter of 1938-1939, conversations took place between the Polish and German foreign ministers, as well as Hitler himself. The Germans sought concessions to settle differences. First, they wanted the free city of Danzig, established by the League of Nations, with its majority German population, to be returned to Germany. And secondly, they wanted to be granted extraterritorial rights over a road across the Polish corridor from East Prussia to the main part of Germany. The corridor again having been granted to Poland by the League of Nations so that it would have access to the sea. In return, Germany hinted, but didn't promise, that it would assist an expansion of Polish influence or territory to the east at the expense of the Soviet Union. The Poles objected that this would make them a dependent satellite of Germany rather than an independent state, as it was only through avoiding hostility or close friendship with either of their powerful neighbors, that's Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east, that independence could be maintained. They refused Hitler's offers, so by the spring of 1939, Poland ceased, from the German perspective, to be a possible ally and instead became an object of conquest. The British guarantee of assistance for Poland meant that as soon as Germany attacked, there was likely to be war. Having failed to get Poland as an ally, Hitler then turned to the Soviet Union, and the result of this was the Nazi-Soviet pact of the 23rd of August 1939. This included secret provisions for Soviet spheres of influence in countries bordering it, as well as arrangements for the partition of Poland, as became evident in September. Hitler assumed that Britain and France's failure to secure Soviet help would cause them to abandon Poland. But 2 days later, Britain signed the formal Anglo-Polish alliance. Hitler was evidently surprised by this and postponed his attack, whilst he tried to persuade the British to cease interfering in Eastern Europe in exchange for Germany supporting the perpetuation of the British Empire. Britain didn't back down. If its threats failed to deter Hitler, then they would be carried out. There would be no concessions unless there were serious guarantees that German policy had ceased to be warlike. But for Hitler, a climb down was impossible. If Britain didn't give him a free hand in the East, then a war with Britain would be inevitable sooner or later. But he would be more likely to get support from the German public for such a war if it was seen as resisting British interference in Germany's solving its grievances with Poland. Both Hitler and the British felt they had no choice. Their objectives were incompatible. Hitler's plan to remodel Eastern Europe required armed force, and success would make Germany dominant in Europe as a whole. For Britain, this was unacceptable, unless Germany could be trusted not to exploit its dominance and threatened British independence. By the summer of 1939, the British government, and seemingly most of the British, saw Hitler as a threat to Britain. The Nazis had stridently praised violence and engaged in well-publicized displays of strength, using armed force to break treaties in the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Thus, 2 days after the German invasion of Poland, Britain declared war on Germany. It was not just the rise of German power, but the nature of German conduct which was unacceptable, a view later reinforced by German conduct during World War II. The cause of World War II was the Nazi propensity to aggression, and the invasion of Poland was simply the occasion. By then, the British government knew that neither the British or the French could now prevent the rapid conquest of Poland, though the Polish government and people expected more from the Western Allies. The Poles were profoundly attached to their national independence, and more ready than most to defend it, even at risk. Whatever its allies did, no Polish government could easily give in. Even a heroic defeat would be acceptable if national respect could be maintained. No one in Poland, of course, could have anticipated the frightful suffering that would be meted out to the Polish people during World War II. The attack on Poland also appealed to many Germans. Now let's turn to the situation in France. It was very different from that in Germany, and Britain for that matter. The only prospect that the French saw in a second war with Germany was the defeat of German power, but that would indicate that the victory of World War I, with all the sacrifices that had entailed, had proved useless. What was to be gained in a new war? As in 1918, even victory would involve loss. There were also structural changes. A declining birth rate had meant that the French population structure was poorly prepared for war. It had suffered proportionally more than any other great power in terms of the number of young men who were killed and injured during the war. After Versailles, the French alliances with Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, and its links with Yugoslavia and Romania, supposedly made France safe. In response to Hitler's aggressions, including the recreation of the German Air Force, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the invasion of Austria, France did little, however, not wanting to risk war. France underwent a steady weakening compared to Germany, and there was an increasing divergence between those of the French leadership favoring different responses. First, let me introduce you to some of the main figures involved in French decision-making at this time. First of all, we have Edouard Daladier, the Prime Minister, who was Prime Minister several times, but from our purposes, the important period is from April 1938 to March 1940. He led a very fractured government full of internal dissensions. In relationship to Germany, his foreign minister, Georges Bonnet, was very much in favor of appeasement. So he was at one extreme. And at the other, you have Paul Reynaud, who was at the other extreme, who was advocating strong opposition and resistance to German aggression, and who later became Prime Minister after Daladier. And then the fourth figure I'll mention very briefly is General Gamelin, the Commander-in-Chief of the French Army. The Daladier government, in power from April 1938 to March 1940, was deeply divided over Czechoslovakia. Some, including the Foreign Minister, Georges Bonnet, and indecisively the Prime Minister, Daladier, favoured giving way in the last resort to avoid war. Others, including Reynaud, thought that a willingness to go to war was the only guarantee of avoiding one. Though they disagreed with the British Prime Minister Chamberlain that concessions would make Hitler less dangerous, they retreated behind his policy so that he could take the blame. The military chiefs, especially their head, General Gamelin, were worried by the loss of Czechoslovakia. In response, they asked the British to increase their commitment in troops in the event of war, and in fear of a German attack on the Low Countries in early 1939, to agree to peacetime conscription and the creation of a larger army than hitherto contemplated. The British had promised by this time to defend France again against German attack, hoping thereby to stiffen French resolve, and for Chamberlain to get greater influence over French policy, to influence it to be conciliatory towards Italy. After the German occupation of Prague in March 1939, it was obvious to the French that German domination of Eastern Europe could only be stopped by force. France was bound to defend Poland by treaty, and Gamelin encouraged Polish resistance, promising that if Germany did attack Poland, then the French would attack Germany on the west. But ideally, the Soviets would also be involved, and when that fell through because of the Nazi-Soviet pact, then Bonnet, the foreign minister, thought it would be better if Poland made concessions so as to avoid the embarrassment of another French desertion of an ally. Even after Munich, he sought to improve relations with Germany, the German foreign minister, Ribbentrop, claiming that Bonnet had privately accepted that Germany should have a free hand in the East. But in 1939, the German seizure of Prague signaled Hitler's untrustworthiness, and Italian claims to French territory were revived, with the Pact of Steel between Italy and Germany in April 1939 adding to the threat. Late in August, Bonnet proposed that France's guarantee to Poland of assistance be abandoned, whilst Gamelin opposed this on a point of honour. It was recognized that if Polish resistance to Germany was prolonged, it would make it impossible for the Germans to attack France in 1939, so giving French forces time to increase arms production. The support of a British expeditionary force would make it easier to defend France in 1940, and a declaration of Italian neutrality removed that threat for the moment. If Italy had joined immediately, France didn't have enough troops for a two-front war. It's hard to assess how much public support there was for the war. Reluctant acquiescence was general. World War I was too recent for there to be much enthusiasm. But for Germans, their war initially seemed like a defense against Western interference, as they belatedly redressed one of what they saw as the injustices of the Versailles Treaty. For the British, there was support for a policy of standing firm. Previous British attempts to redress German grievances over the years had been rebuffed, so it was accepted that Hitler had to be stopped. For the French, the situation was more ambiguous. Were there further possibilities for peaceful negotiation? But in July 1939, opinion polls in both France and Britain gave 76% of respondents approving war if Germany attacked Poland. The war itself begins at dawn on the 1st of September with the German invasion of Poland. The British delayed their declaration of war at French request, but issued it at 12 noon on the 3rd of September. The French followed on the same day at 5 p.m. Many thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, and thank you to you also for listening to the video. If you want, you're very welcome to support my channel. Please do like, comment and share the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll talk about the German invasion of Poland. Have a good day.